Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS frameworks and preprocessors. To set the expectations here, we won't be discussing individual frameworks in any great detail, but rather we will be looking at the high-level similarities and differences between them. Oftentimes you will hear the word framework as a fairly generic term, but really there are two categories of tools we are discussing here. First, a CSS framework is simply pre-written code that we can use in our projects to speed up development. This usually comes in the form of pre-written style sheets or pre-built components. A preprocessor, on the other hand, is a way to add functionality to the language. The browser only understands pure CSS, but preprocessors are programs that convert some other code into CSS for us, to essentially add some nice features to the language. This can be a great way to speed up development and also allows us to write good high-quality code that is easy to maintain. Now first, let's take a look at some of the most common frameworks. Again, we won't be diving deep into the implementation of these frameworks. The purpose of this video will simply be to understand the high-level differences between them. Okay, so first up is Tailwind, and this is a framework that provides some customizable utility classes that we can use in our HTML that give us pre-made CSS. For example, we could use it to make sure we are being consistent with our own design system. So as an example of this, it can create classes for us of each of the different background colors that we might be using on our website. Then we can add those classes to the HTML elements that need them, and they will have the background color, and we won't have to write that CSS manually. As a result, when we use Tailwind, we tend to not have to write much CSS at all, and it becomes very easy to build consistent designs that are responsive. On the other hand, this heavy use of classes can deter some people from using it, as they might feel like the styling information is being all put inside of HTML, and this can cause the HTML files to get a little bit harder to read. That said, it is a great option, and it's used very frequently throughout the industry. Next up, we have Bootstrap, and Bootstrap is arguably the most popular CSS framework, and it has been for some time. It was originally developed by Twitter with the intent of developing consistent designs that were responsive. It comes with a variety of pre-built components that you can use to quickly get a professional-looking website with very little effort. That said, due to its popularity, you'll want to be careful about using these pre-built components in their basic form without customization, because it can tend to make your website look like every other Bootstrap website rather than having its own style. Bootstrap also has an incredibly powerful grid layout system. It's somewhat similar to the built-in CSS grid, and it can make building high-quality layouts extremely easy. One other downside to be aware of with Bootstrap is that it does mean adding a very large CSS file to your website. This can slow down page load times, and it also means it can be difficult to customize some of the components, as you might need to do some searching to see what properties you need to actually override. And next we have Materialize, which is a very similar framework to Bootstrap. However, it is based on the Google Material UI design system. Similar to Bootstrap, this framework has its own grid-based layout system, and it comes with many pre-built, high-quality, responsive components that you can use directly in your websites to give them a professional feel right out of the box. The original Material UI design system developed at Google was inspired by the concept of a paper and ink, and they focused on making designs that felt familiar even while on a screen. And this design system has been extremely successful for them at Google. The biggest drawback here could also be stated as being its biggest strength, and that's that your websites will need to follow the Google Material UI design system throughout to be consistent with these components. In general, this is a very strong, well thought out design system, but it's just something to keep in mind as you customize Materialize components. You will want to stay consistent with their principles. Moving on, Foundation is yet another extremely popular CSS framework with a variety of pre-built UI components and a grid system for responsive design. Oftentimes, Foundation can be a bit easier to customize than some of the other CSS frameworks, but that's not to say that the other ones can't be customized or that Foundation is the only one with that ability. Usually the biggest deciding factor between these three frameworks or any of the other ones out there will simply be which has the design system that best fits into the style of the website you are looking to build. Finally, Bulma is probably the least popular on this list, but it is unique in that it is a CSS-only framework. Most CSS frameworks require that you include some of their JavaScript code on your website, but Bulma doesn't do this. This means that Bulma is less opinionated about the implementation of your components, as it is purely focused on assisting with the styling. That said, it also means that there will be more work to get everything up and running, as you will need to write more JavaScript code than you might need to with some of the other framework options. All that said, these are just a few of the CSS frameworks out there, and there are tons more of them to explore. However, most of them do tend to be extremely similar to each other, just with a few specific pros and cons to compare before choosing which one might be right for your project. Now let's take a look at preprocessors. There aren't quite as many of these out there, but there are still a ton of options to choose from. By far the most popular of these options is Sass, which is a language extension to CSS, providing its own syntax for some extra functionality. For example, it includes variables, mix-ins which allow you to reuse blocks of code, the ability for classes to extend one another, nesting syntax instead of needing complex combinators, looping syntax, and a ton more. Less is very similar to Sass, although it is a bit less popular of an option. Arguably the biggest difference between the two is that Sass uses Ruby, while Less is written in JavaScript. That said, the more important differences will be the syntax, because largely they have very similar features, just with different syntax for how you write the code to use those features. Next, Stylus is another preprocessor option that is very similar to Sass in functionality, just with different syntax again. One of its biggest focuses is on making the syntax simple, so it makes just about all punctuation marks such as braces, colons, semicolons, and commas completely optional. Many developers coming from a Python background tend to find Stylus an appealing option for this reason, since CSS syntax becomes much more similar to Python when you use the Stylus preprocessor. Finally, PostCSS is a bit of a different option. It is another JavaScript-based tool, but with a much higher focus on customizability. It comes with a variety of plugins, and you can choose which plugins you want to use to transform your CSS, almost like building your own preprocessor for your specific projects. For example, one of the plugins will parse your CSS and add any vendor-specific prefixes needed to make your CSS work on various versions of different browsers. And this is just one of the many plugins that you have as an option when you use PostCSS. Okay, so now let's answer the big question. Should you be using frameworks and preprocessors? And of course, the answer is, it depends. For frameworks, this really depends on the projects that you're working on. For projects with smaller teams or shorter deadlines, I would almost always say yes, use frameworks to help speed up your development and focus on features rather than reinventing the wheel. However, as projects scale up, there can be value in building out your own components to make your website feel unique and fully customized. That said, for these large projects, you can still use frameworks, and many huge companies are. You'll just want to make sure that you are putting in substantial work to customize those components to fit in with your own style and brand. On the side of preprocessors, I think the answer here is oftentimes a bit easier. Usually, yes, I would recommend them. Sass tends to be the most popular option, but any preprocessor will make your CSS easier to write, more maintainable, and less likely to contain bugs. That said, there's nothing wrong with using pure CSS instead of using a framework or a preprocessor. Additionally, if you're just learning CSS or trying to brush up on your skills, I would say don't use any frameworks or preprocessors and focus on the fundamentals of the language rather than having these tools abstract those things away from you. And then of course you can learn the tools after you feel comfortable with the fundamentals of CSS. And with all that said, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS frameworks and preprocessors. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.